OCON, the Objectivist Annual Conference, is almost here. From June 13th to 18th, fans and students of Ayn Rand will gather from all around the world in Anaheim, California. They're coming to experience inspiring talks by experts on objectivism, to sample classes of popular courses from Ayn Rand University and its faculty, partake in social events like annual gala and poker tournament, and attend artistic performances, including the fan favorite talent show. We will enjoy late night conversations with new and old friends, and generally experience the community of objectivism for a whole week together. You can still join. You can follow the link in the description to book your spot. If you cannot attend live, unfortunately, you can still purchase a digital pass, which gives you virtual access to lectures and talks and participation live in Q&A periods. So follow those links, register if you still can. Welcome to New Ideal, the podcast of the Ayn Rand Institute. I'm Robertas Bakula, and today I will be previewing some of the talks featured at the OCON conference by new and returning speakers. I talked to Jason Rheins, fellow and instructor at ARI, who are we glad is returning to OCON, Tristan de Liège, a postdoctoral fellow who will be appearing on OCON stage for the first time, and finally Mike Mazza, associated fellow at ARI who is returning to OCON stage 2. I had the benefit of watching all those talks being developed and practiced, so I'm super excited to share a sneak peek with you, and the following are the highlights of my pre-recorded conversations with all these speakers. First, we will jump to Jason Rheins. Hi, Jason.
Hi, Robertas. How are you?
Good to see you. How are you? You're returning to OCON after some time, right? How do you feel about
it? Feels good. I'm looking forward to seeing old faces and to meeting new faces, so to speak, and just getting out in front of the community a little more, so that more people interested in ARI and its content know what I've got to talk about.
For those new faces you mentioned who don't know you, can you briefly tell us your background and what do you do at ARI?
Sure. So I am a scholar and instructor. I do a lot of mentoring for junior intellectuals, so people who already are PhDs or are pursuing that, or some related kind of professional intellectual field, writers, and so on. My background is in philosophy and the history of philosophy. I have a PhD in philosophy. My area of closest specialization is in ancient Greek philosophy, but I do a bunch of other things too. There are some old OCON courses I did. There's one on poetry. There are two on the philosophy of Kant. And there were a couple other OCON talks along the way. One a long time ago about Greek theology and so on. So, yeah.
Now, you mentioned you specialize in, one of the things you specialize in is ancient Greek philosophy, which makes sense because your talk is called Socratic Wisdom, the title of your talk at OCON. And in the description, you define it or call it knowing your own ignorance. Is that what Socratic Wisdom is?
I wouldn't say it's a definition, just like wisdom isn't limited to knowing what's good or bad, but also involves the practical ability to judge in the moment and with particulars. Is this a good or bad thing? Is this practical or impractical? And so on. Similarly, Socratic wisdom isn't just all the knowledge you have about what you don't know. It's an aspect of the practice of objectivity, of rationality. It's having a good sense, all else being equal, habitually, for what you don't know and what you do, by contrast.
Didn't Socrates say something like, all I know is that I know nothing, which is often is meant to mean that you cannot be certain of anything. But you just said that it's more about objectivity and knowing what you don't know. But how does it differ from how we interpret Socrates generally?
Yeah. So the the pseudo quote, "I know that I only know that I know nothing," isn't something that Plato's Socrates ever says. It's a bit of a play it again, Sam. People watch Casablanca and they expect Humphrey Bogart to say "play it again, Sam." He never actually says "play it again, Sam." Um,
Hmm.
Similarly, Socrates never says "I only know that I know nothing," but he says things that could be confused for that and that could sound like that. So he says, I'm aware that I have no wisdom, great or small, but wisdom is not the same as knowledge. By wisdom, he means knowledge about very valuable things and expertise is the kind that not just anybody has. And so he says, I don't know anything fine and noble. He says, more particularly, he says, what other people think they know but don't, I don't think I know the things I don't know. And unlike we only know that I only know that I know nothing, which is a contradiction, I don't think I know the things I don't is not a contradiction. That's perfectly coherent and quite valuable. So uh, it's a good kind of case in point. People think they know that Socrates said something he never actually, or that Plato's Socrates said something that he didn't actually say. But there are things that you could confuse, and people, including Plato scholars, have made that confusion.
Okay, so this is already interesting. The thing we even think Socrates says might not be true as you present it. So uh, definitely something to look forward in a talk where you explain. But in relation to that, can I ask you another thing? One,
Sure.
in academic circles or generally intellectual circles, I often hear people talking about a virtue of intellectual humility, as we call it,
Mm-hmm.
uh, of being never being too sure of what you know and always being, as I understand what they mean, always being open to question anything you think you are certain of. How does that relate to your talk and to Socratic wisdom as such?
I think that intellectual humility is a bad take on the same phenomenon that is Socratic wisdom. So there's a real value in it's a part of objectivity to have a good assessment of how well you know the things that you do know and how much you don't know where you don't have knowledge. Um, but in order to be able to do that, you actually need to know things. So, um, knowledge of one's own ignorance is not a kind of ignorance, it's a kind of knowledge. And like other kinds of knowledge, it builds on pre existing knowledge. So, for example, I know that I don't know that much about, let's say, reptile biology, but I couldn't know that unless I knew about the science of biology, the sub science of zoology, and the sub science of herpetology, which studies reptiles. And I know that there are experts who study this, and I know that they know lots of things that I don't know. All of those things are knowledge. If I had never heard of such a thing as biology, if I lived in some pre scientific society where there was just sort of folk wisdom about the living creatures around me, I might not be aware of it. There's lots to know about reptiles that I don't, or anyone else does, or doesn't for that matter. So when so intellectual humility attempts to overcome or at least to mitigate various biases, cognitive biases that people often fall into. And these are biases that arise from not knowing what you don't know or not being very clear on the degree of certainty or exactitude for the beliefs that you have. And it attempts to to lessen the kind of pitfalls here, to help you avoid them, by sort of blanketly, or more or less, undercutting the kind of top level of certainty that you assign to things. If you never get too confident, then you can't be overconfident. That's an oversimplification, but that's roughly the spirit of it. Now, when you know that you don't know things that you don't, you're open to new information about them that you might not be if you thought you knew them well and you didn't. So, in both cases, we're trying to overcome a problem that arises thinking you have more knowledge and more subjective certainty, more confidence that is undeserved. In that sense, we're talking about the same thing and proposing ways to deal with it. But whereas the essence of humility is to not value oneself or what one has too highly and thereby overestimate oneself, what I'm suggesting is to know exactly what one's worth is and not and what is not beyond it. So I'm talking about a kind of knowledge that builds from a certain kind of certainty. There are some things we know for sure. There's some things we know without any need to doubt them further. And if we're aware of that and we have the right methods and perspectives, then we also know that there are lots of other things in our heads that are not at that level. But to the right way to counter the pitfalls of talking about what you don't know about is not to assume you don't know what you're talking about at any given time, or to always think you could be wrong. It's to be clearer about the things where you could be wrong and the things where you are certain to the best of your abilities, or just certain period, that you can't be wrong.
Well, I think I've heard enough about what the talk will be, and not to spoil other advice and other methods that you'll be talking about to the audience, but I'm excited to learn more, and I think this was helpful. Thank you, Jason, and I hope
Or
this
less.
or less. That's maybe we'll
Well, no,
realize
in
some.
fact, learning what you don't know is knowledge. So you will learn more. I hope.
I hope so too. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Robertas.
Okay, next on the list is Tristan de Liège and his lecture on valuing friendship. Tristan, you're here.
Hey, yeah, hey Robertas, thanks
This,
for having me.
of course, this is your first time appearing on OCON stage, isn't it? How do you feel about it?
Yeah, it is. I'm excited. I have been coming to OCON for many years, and I just have so many great memories of so many great talks from before. So to be a part of that process and to hopefully give something that people walk away feeling inspired and excited about is really fun and exciting for me. So I'm looking forward to it.
Me too. So, because your talk is about how to value friendship, why did you choose this topic? Why friendship?
Well, I chose this topic because, for one, Rand wrote comparatively little about friendship, um, but she clearly held it as a major value in human life. And it's worth thinking about what an objectivist view or an objectivist account of friendship would look like. And so that was one thing that got me interested in it. And then also, it comes up in the novels in very interesting ways, but in ways that, again, not a lot of objectivists have written about in particular. So, for example, you think about the friendship between Galt, Francisco, and Ragnar in Atlas Shrugged, the friendship between Howard Rourke and Stephen Mallory, and Howard Rourke and Gail Wynand in The Fountainhead, between Dagny Taggart and Eddie Willers and Atlas Shrugged as well. And then even in We the Living, I think there's even a kind of friendship between Kira and Andre, although that has some other layers to it as well. But we have all of these interesting examples from the novels of interesting, deep friendships. And I think it's there's a lot we can learn about Rand's view of friendship from that, but we kind of have to do some work to extract it because she doesn't write directly about friendship. So in the novels, we see the kinds of friendships where friends are prepared to literally die for each other. And part of what's really interesting about that is these are characters who, well, in particular the heroes, who are portrayed as egoists. So on the one hand, you have people whose they recognize and accept that their ultimate value is their own lives, but they're willing to value their friends for their own sake, and perhaps even equal on a par with their own lives. And there's a question of how how do those kind of friendships form? Like, how do we develop those kinds of friendships if we want those kind of deep friendships where people see us in a very deep way, when they understand what we're striving for, they understand our deepest struggles and so on. And what philosophy has to say about it, or the reason philosophy is relevant, is because to have those deepest kinds of friendships, you need to understand the deepest kinds of moral values of character that those kinds of friendships are based on. And then there's work to be done of breaking down how exactly those moral values get shared and reflected by the friends to each other. And what I'd like to do in this talk is give us at least a brief insight into how Objectivism can help us look at friendship in that way.
Okay, so can you give a little bit of an indication of what it will look like, of the objective, how objectivism will help us look at it this way? Because most of us have probably some understanding that valuable friendships, they require thought, they require work, they require constant cultivation. We shouldn't take them for granted, and they do not just come into our lives. They have to be pursued and worked on constantly, as any relationship. So then, what do you think then the people, or give us some, if you can give us some sneak peek about what will we take away from your talk with regards to our friendships as an audience?
Right. So even if we agree that, yeah, friendships are things that require time and effort and work, there's, if we put it that way, there's still a lot of questions we might have about, well, what are you working towards exactly? Like, what's the ideal of what you're creating? Are you seeking someone who's an activity partner? Are you seeking someone who is going to inspire you? Does your friend need to inspire you? Um, are you seeking a kind of psychological visibility? What kind of visibility are you seeking? How do you offer visibility to someone else? What is the nature of psychological visibility? I think that, so I brought up psychological visibility just now. I think that's the ultimate basis of friendship from the objectivist perspective. Um, and we'll see that looking at the examples from the novels that I talked about, as well as some other examples. But I think visibility is a very intricate and interesting issue. And um, what I think the audience can expect is to learn a bit more about the philosophical meaning and importance of psychological visibility in friendship, and how it relates to core philosophical values such as self-esteem and purpose. And in addition to that, maybe gain some inspiration for new ways that um, they can deepen their existing friendships in light of this perspective on psychological visibility.
I hope you're as excited to think deeply about your friendships as I am listening to Tristan talking. So uh, now, finally, we turn to Mike Mazza and his lecture on Karl Popper's Rejection of Induction. All right. Hi, Mike. Good to have you here. I know you're a little under the weather, but I appreciate you joining to talk about your OCON lecture on Karl Popper and Rejection of Induction. Before we dive in, can you tell our audience a little bit of your background. I know, for example, I took your course on philosophy of science in ERU, but you have more in your pocket uh, to talk about before we jump into your subject.
Yeah, so I have a PhD in philosophy from St. Louis University, which I completed in 2020. At ARI, as you mentioned, teach in the Ayn Rand University program. I also do some writing for the Institute. I recently published an article on the reception of Ayn Rand in academic philosophy. I'm currently working on an article on her ethics.
So Karl Popper is clearly in your wheelhouse, but who was he? Can you tell us more about who was Karl Popper and why is it important for the audience, especially at OCON, to know something about him and about his views of science?
So Popper was an Austrian-born philosopher who did spent most of his career in English universities, principally the London School of Economics. He's a incredibly influential figure in two ways. So first is his work in philosophy of science, and it's come to the point where if you ask scientists to sort of articulate why science is rational, why it deserves our respect, as opposed to superstitions or the pseudo sciences pretending to be science, they'll give some sort of Popperian explanation. They'll say something like, "Well, science is testable. Scientists try to come up with ways to disprove their own theories, to falsify their own theories." That's Popper's view of science, that science is about falsifying our hypotheses, not about proving them. Importantly for Popper, you can't prove a hypothesis. So if you've heard someone say that, well, what's great about science is we're never fully certain. What we can do in the sciences is put things to the test. We can use testing to ensure that we're less wrong, maybe in more optimistic moods, closer to the truth, but never fully at it. That's another Popperian perspective. Now, the second respect in which Popper is influenced is his work in social political philosophy. His book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, is widely considered the best or one of the best. This isn't my opinion. This is a received opinion. Defenses of liberal democracies, in the kind of post-war period. So it's a criticism of Marxism and various forms of totalitarianism. Very influential. Popper's philosophy of science and his political thinking is very influential on the Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek, who Popper dedicated one of his books to, and Hayek recommended Popper. It's also influential on sort of culturally left type people. George Soros has a foundation called the Open Society, which gets its name from Popper's book. So Popper's influence is everywhere in the sciences, and then more broadly, just in the culture. It doesn't really fall into a left right divide. So my OCON talk is going to cover his philosophy of science. It's a 40-minute talk, so I can't cover everything he wrote on, but we'll cover the basics of his philosophy of science. And I think Popper would I think this is true, and I think Popper would think this way, that the political ideas, the social ideas he has are sort of like his broader epistemology kind of applied. So to understand the political influence, you have to understand the philosophy of science and the broader view of rationality that he has.
I want you to elaborate a little bit on this because for me it's very interesting. I'm somebody interested in economics. I've read Hayek, and therefore my knowledge of Popper comes from there. And I understand the importance of Popper's influence because people like Hayek, who influence me and my understanding, cite him. But what about people who do not read academic articles or maybe don't go that deep into methodology of science? What can they, who are occasional consumers of science, if I may say so, what can they expect to get out of this talk about Popper's view of the method of science?
So Popper's been influential on how scientists think about science. he's been influential in the broader culture, as I said. But actually, if you look at how philosophers of science today think, they're not Popperians. They think he's a little passé. Like, not that there isn't anybody. So he's not like a niche academic figure. In fact, most of the attention he gets is from people outside of academia, or at least outside of philosophy, so people in the sciences. So his view of science is really, it's more broadly, he's got a view of what it is to be rational. So he's what makes science rational. So he's got a broad view of rationality, and this is influential on people like Steven Pinker, or the rationality community, or the rationalist community, as it's sometimes called. David Deutsch is a physicist / public intellectual who's quite good on a number of things, but sees himself as a Popperian. He develops some views of his own in philosophy of science that he thinks of as Popperian. Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, other people that if you follow them, you'll pick up on. I mean, if you're familiar with Popper, you'll pick up on the Popperian influences on how they think about certainty and rationality. They think of it again as certainty is questionable, maybe even dangerous, leads to authoritarianism. What's rational is not to seek certainty, but to just be always on the lookout for information or evidence that might falsify or refute some belief you have, or some hypothesis you're holding on to. So the way that that a lot of people, including some people who are in some respects quite good, think about rationality is deeply influenced by Popper, either in some cases directly, like I mentioned, David Deutsch, who's explicitly drawing from Popper, and in other figures, it's more like downstream. They might not even fully understand that they're Popperian in their way of thinking. So I think if you want to understand that that part of the culture and the rationality community and the progress studies people and the the accelerationist movement, there's Popperian influences on all of those people. And as I'm going to argue in the talk, Popper's views, I think, undercut rationality despite his own aims to defend it or to explain it.
Right, and part of how he does that, my sense of from your talk's description, is by rejecting induction, which objectivism thinks is crucial and essential part of how we acquire knowledge, especially in science, right? So can you say something about, highlight the difference between how Popper thinks about approach to achieving knowledge in scientific pursuits versus what objectivism would say is an essential part of that?
Yeah, so Popper, I think, I think of Mazza kind of having an optimistic skepticism. There is a way the world is. So he's not like a complete subjectivist, like the world has no identity or something. But we can never really know the truth with respect to that, like the deep structure of the world. We can get closer to it by making bold, risky predictions, postulations, theorizing, and putting them to the test. And to him, it really doesn't matter where our conjectures come from. You might base them on prior thinking. They might come to you like a bolt from the blue. Like, that's kind of psychology. That's not epistemology. Where do your hypotheses come from? What we can judge as rational or irrational is what we do once we have these hypotheses. Do we put them to the test? So there's no gathering of evidence in favor of a hypothesis. When you have a theory and it passes a rigorous test, that is not grounds to say that the theory is confirmed or proven or better supported. What it is you can say that the theory hasn't been rejected yet. It's the most rigorously tested theory that hasn't been refuted. But you're never in a position to say, yeah, we're certain that this is true, or that this is true, or that it's probably true. You can only say that the theory has been refuted. Now, objectivism, as you mentioned, views science inductively, that there is a process of gathering evidence, confirmation, support, that it matters where a hypothesis comes from. Hypotheses need to be generated based on evidence. We don't think that's psychology. We think that's epistemology, and that the result of an inductive process is a true theory, which you can have certainty in, which informs you of the deep causal structure of the world, like depending on how advanced the theory is, the causal structure of the world. Popper rejects induction because he thinks it's kind of like a form of passive revelation. He talks about perception or observation as if it's a authoritarian source of belief. So he makes the comparison between observation and like the authority of the church, and he does that. I mean, he's wrong to view observation that way, but he's right to be skeptical of any view of science that sees it as passive revelation. So Popper, and I think this is what attracts a lot of people to Popper, is very much interested in arguing that science is an active, ongoing process of investigation. Now, where he goes wrong, I mean, one of the ways he goes wrong is just thinking that the only way a scientist can be active in his investigation is by like rooting out errors and testing. Objectivism, for example, thinks you have to be active in the formation of your concepts, which and alien, that idea is alien to Popper. So we'll, of course, I'll elaborate on all of this and draw it out further in the talk, but that's the basic difference.
Yeah, certainly you can't explain all of it in 5 minutes explanation. That's why you're preparing a lecture. So I hope this gives enough of a taste for the audience who will be at OCON or might choose to attend OCON and see this talk. I'm really excited. So thank you, Mike, for giving us a sneak peek of that. And I'll see you at OCON.
Thanks, Robertas.
So we've glanced at some of the experts who will be talking at OCON and what they'll be talking about. I hope this gives you a sense of what the conference is about and gets you excited to join us. The registration is still open. If you unfortunately can't attend live, you can attend virtually by purchasing a digital pass that gives you live access to lectures and Q&A periods. I hope I'll see you in Anaheim. I will be there. See you soon.